Few names in history have become as synonymous with betrayal as Judas Iscariot. His story is told in all four Gospels: Gospel of Matthew, Gospel of Mark, Gospel of Luke, and Gospel of John. And yet, despite his central role in the arrest of Jesus, much about him remains debated, complex, and deeply human. Was he purely a villain driven by greed, or a tragic figure caught in forces larger than himself? Judas Iscariot was one of the 12 apostles chosen by Jesus. His surname, Iscariot, likely means man of Kerioth, suggesting he may have come from a town in Judea, which would make him the only apostle not from Galilee. This detail, while not certain, has led some scholars to suggest he may have felt culturally or socially different from the others. The Gospels present Judas as entrusted with responsibility. According to the Gospel of John, he was the keeper of the disciples' money bag. This indicates that he was trusted. However, John also adds a critical detail. He says Judas would sometimes steal from the money bag. This portrayal frames him as morally compromised, even before the betrayal. It is important to note that John's Gospel was written later than the others and reflects theological reflection after the events. The pivotal moment in Judas's story begins with his decision to betray Jesus. In the Gospel of Matthew, Judas goes to the chief priests and asks, "What are you willing to give me if I deliver him to you?" They agree on 30 pieces of silver. This amount is significant. In the Old Testament book of Exodus, 30 pieces of silver is listed as the compensation for a slave accidentally killed. The symbolism is powerful. Jesus is valued at the price of a slave. The Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of John add another layer, stating that Satan entered into Judas. This does not necessarily remove Judas's responsibility, but it introduces the idea of spiritual influence. The text does not describe this in detailed metaphysical terms. Rather, it emphasizes the gravity of his decision. The betrayal itself occurs during the events leading up to the crucifixion. At the Last Supper, described in the Gospels, Jesus announces that one of the disciples will betray him. In Matthew's account, Judas directly asks, "Surely you don't mean me, Rabbi?" And Jesus replies, "You have said so." In John's account, Jesus identifies Judas by giving him a piece of bread. Shortly afterward, Judas leaves the meal. John's Gospel adds a symbolic line, "And it was night." The darkness reflects both the literal time and the moral weight of the moment. Later, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Judas arrives with a crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent by the chief priests. He identifies Jesus with a kiss. This act has become one of the most powerful images of betrayal in history. A gesture of affection used as a signal for arrest. Jesus responds, according to Matthew, "Friend, do what you came for." Even in this moment, there is no recorded anger from Jesus toward Judas. What happened to Judas afterward is described differently in the New Testament. In Matthew's account, Judas feels remorse. He returns the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests, saying, "I have sinned, for I have betrayed innocent blood." The priests refuse responsibility. Judas throws the money into the temple and leaves. He then hangs himself. The priests use the silver to buy a field, which becomes known as the Field of Blood. In the book of Acts of the Apostles, there is another description. It says Judas acquired a field with the reward of his wickedness, and there he fell headlong, his body bursting open. Scholars have long debated how these two accounts fit together. Some suggest that Judas hanged himself and later his body fell. Others see theological emphasis rather than strict narrative detail. What is clear is that Judas died tragically, and that his death was seen as a consequence of his actions. An additional text, discovered in the 20th century, called the Gospel of Judas, presents a radically different portrayal. In this Gnostic writing, Judas is depicted not as a villain, but as the only disciple who truly understands Jesus. In that text, Jesus allegedly asks Judas to betray him as part of a divine plan. However, this document dates to the 2nd century and reflects Gnostic theology, not the earlier apostolic tradition found in the canonical Gospels. Most scholars consider it historically unreliable regarding the actual events of Judas's life. The central theological question is whether Judas had a choice. The Gospels repeatedly suggest that Jesus knew he would be betrayed. Some passages refer to fulfillment of Scripture, particularly Psalm 41-9, which speaks of a close friend who turns against the righteous sufferer. Yet foreknowledge does not automatically mean coercion. The text portrays Judas making deliberate decisions approaching the priests, negotiating payment, identifying Jesus. Responsibility is not removed. Psychologically, Judas's remorse in Matthew is one of the most haunting aspects of his story. The Greek word used suggests deep regret. However, instead of seeking forgiveness, Judas isolates himself and ends his life. In contrast, Peter, who also denies Jesus 3 times, weeps bitterly but later returns and is restored. This comparison highlights a key theme. Failure is not the end, but despair can be. So was Judas purely a villain? The Gospels clearly present his act as betrayal and sin. Yet they also show him as a real person, trusted, conflicted, remorseful. He was not an outsider enemy. He was one of the 12. That makes his story more tragic. He walked with Jesus, heard his teachings, witnessed miracles, and still chose betrayal. My personal opinion is that Judas represents the complexity of human freedom. He was not a cartoon villain motivated only by greed. 30 pieces of silver was not an enormous fortune. His actions likely involved disillusionment, misunderstanding of Jesus' mission, and perhaps political expectation. Many Jews at the time hoped for a revolutionary Messiah who would overthrow Roman rule. When Jesus spoke of suffering and sacrifice instead, some followers may have struggled. I see Judas as a tragic figure, not because his betrayal was justified, but because he stood so close to truth and still turned away. His story is a warning about how proximity to goodness does not guarantee loyalty, and how remorse without hope can destroy a person. At the same time, his life forces readers to confront uncomfortable questions about choice, destiny, and forgiveness. In that sense, Judas Iscariot remains one of the most psychologically and spiritually complex figures in the entire New Testament.